Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Daisy Dice, channel where we talk about Salvadorian history or stories about Salvadorians. I am feeling a little sick today. That's why I'm drinking some tea. I'm drinking Theraflu, actually. It's not tea, so Theraflu night at that. So let's start this story before it kicks in and I'm sleepy. So, as always, Will's in the background. Hi,
What's
Will. Today we are going to be talking about soccer, war, politics, all the above. And this is not a political channel, but history, maybe 11 out of 10 times is political. I don't know. Comment below what you think about history and politics. Sorry if I get sidetracked a bunch. I'm just really feeling under the weather, actually, but I'm happy to be here. Oh, and we're in a new setup. So be patient with me, please. This is a TV. I am holding a piñata stick. It will all make sense as we move forward. I also have a whiteboard in front of me. I know you guys don't see it, but it helps my brain tell the story because it has a lot of facts and a lot of numbers. Well, as before we start, I do want to give a special shout out to all the new subscribers that came over here. I did a raffle where I raffled one of these sweaters, my Salvi sweater, and a lot of people subscribed. By a lot I mean 15, but I super duper appreciate every new subscriber. Like, welcome to the fam, and I am happy that you're here learning history with me, Salvadorian history. But let's get started. Well, have you ever played or been into soccer?
Not really, honestly.
Really?
It's never really been my sport. I played in like high school in gym class, but
And did you ever get into it or no?
no, not really.
Okay. So a little background. Soccer, and I'm pretty sure you know, soccer can be a very intense sport. In the Latin community, Salvadorian community, I think like everybody and their father plays soccer at one point. If you go, in the community we live, if you go to any school, most Salvadorians, I would say, play soccer or have played soccer. So the sport is it runs deep in our blood, I would say. And it ran so deep that in 1969, it started a war. The 1969 soccer war is also known as the 100-hour war because it started because of the competition between Honduras and El Salvador for the World Cup that year. It was going to be hosted in Mexico, and things got very steamy, very violent, very political. It was honestly, I'll reserve my opinions for the end, but it was crazy. The 1969 war is also known as the 100-hour war because it was literally 100 hours long. It was roughly like, what is it, like 4 days long. But there was over 2,000 casualties. 300,000 Salvadorians were booted out of Honduras, and this would set the precedent in El Salvador for the 1979 Civil War.
Wow.
So it was a big deal when this happened. And I would say, as a Salvadorian who immigrated to the United States, this gives me a little glimpse of maybe this is a domino effect as to why I'm here sitting in the US. So the year was 1969. The soccer matches were in June. And I'm going to say the months like very precisely because they matter. So the three soccer matches were in June. The first soccer match happened in June 8th in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. That's the capital of Honduras. The soccer game was so intense. No one scored until I think it was like overtime, like the last minute. It was this very dramatic score by Honduras. So that meant that Honduras had won that game. The night before in Honduras, people would be rioting. People really went out in the streets and kind of, it was like protests were happening, but it was like, okay, like it was like, oh, these fans are passionate, and it was intense, but it wasn't like violent. It was just like, at least that's what I understood from what I read. But when Honduras won that game, like, Salvadorians were pissed, to the point where it was reported that a Salvadorian woman offed herself. When this woman offed herself, the country, El Salvador, ran with it and mass media the whole event of this woman offed herself because Hondurans. It was reported that like her funeral was televised, right? So it was almost like propaganda from El Salvador.
That's crazy. She killed herself after the first game. Like, did she like? Because then they have 2 more games after that. So she just lost hope. Like,
yeah,
we lost the first game. That's it.
I'll touch more on that. One might say it was dramatic for her to off herself, but when I tell you more information, you will see why this was a big deal. The second game was in June 15th in San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador. El Salvador won by 3 scores. So Honduras 0, El Salvador 3. When the Honduran athletes came to El Salvador, the Salvadorians protested outside their hotel room to the point where the Honduran athletes could not sleep. This one was a violent protest. People were just going ham, and their idea was that if they can't sleep, they're gonna perform badly tomorrow. And they did, because they lost the game, and El Salvador won. When this happened, all hell broke loose. And there's a player from the Honduran team that said, "I'm glad we lost that game. If not, we would have all been dead." That's how intense the energy was in the stadium and outside the streets. So after El Salvador won that game, Honduras broke all diplomatic ties with El Salvador.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy?
That's crazy, yeah.
Yeah, so it's very political. I think it goes to show like nationalism at its finest. Sometimes as I was reading more of these stories, sometimes I thought to myself, because I'm from El Salvador and moved to the US, I get stuck in like, what we hear in the media, like the US versus the Latino immigrant. But we forget that there's borders everywhere. The US border is not the only border that exists. So there's feuds everywhere. The last game was June 26th in Mexico City. And they did the game in Mexico City because it was too risky to do it in Honduras or in El Salvador. So they're like, you know what, let's just go to Mexico and do the game there. In that game, Honduras lost and El Salvador won by 1 goal. It's June 26th. El Salvador won the last game. So El Salvador is looked as like the winner. Salvadorians are so excited and happy. Honduras, I think, is a little bitter, but super fair because both parties are playing kind of dirty. And then July 14th, El Salvador goes to war with Honduras. And I say it in that order because that's exactly what happened. El Salvador literally took all their like army and all their weapons, their planes that were from World War II. Fucking weird. They were American planes that they had purchased somehow, and took them into Honduras. So imagine just another country like, whoop, like let me just drive with all my army to the other border and start shooting and destroying. They made it to the city's capital, Tegucigalpa, and they kind of just both go at each other. Honduras was caught off guard, though. Even though Honduras had a bigger army than El Salvador, they were caught off guard. It took them a little bit to, like, react to what was happening. El Salvador went berserk to the point where they had weapons, they had an army. The army wasn't as trained and they ran out of ammunition. The war lasted 4 days because the AOS, I believe it's called, asked for a peace treaty. So the war lasted 4 days because OAS, the Organization of American States, asked El Salvador to do a ceasefire. Salvador was like, okay, I'll stop shooting, but I'm not leaving here until August. So even though the war lasted until from July 14th to July 18th, El Salvador left until like August 2nd, I believe. So I will say, I love El Salvador, but El Salvador was acting like a big ass kid, honestly. Both parties lost over like 2,000 people in those 4 days. I couldn't really understand if it was like around 2,000 each country or 2,000 together, but around 2,000 or more people were lost in those 4 days. And these were people who were like the armies, but then also like citizens who joined in and started fighting for their country. So it was devastating. After that, over 300,000 Salvadoran immigrants migrated back to El Salvador. So these immigrants were living in Honduras, and after this war, it was not safe to be Salvadorian and be in Honduras, so they went back to El Salvador.
That's crazy. It had like a ripple effect on people's like well-being, low-key like displaced people, because they're like, now we have to leave.
Yeah. When all 300,000 people went back to El Salvador, El Salvador, the country, felt that it wasn't ready. El Salvador wasn't working properly already. Plus, you put 300,000 displaced people. It was like, oh shoot, it kind of broke. You may ask, why? How did this happen? Like, why did it start? Were they just mad because they actually lost? Or was Honduras mad because they lost? Or was El Salvador just being a big bully? When I tell you, it was just like a hole. I went into like a deep dive of like this story, and it was just like a hole with more facts and more questions and more like information. What happened was, for the last 10 years, for the last decade, El Salvador was migrating, Salvadorians was migrating to Honduras, because Honduras is actually 5 times larger than El Salvador. So Honduras is like roughly like Virginia, and El Salvador is like Massachusetts, the size. So in 1969, El Salvador had 3.7 million people, and Honduras had 2.6 million people. So imagine that, like, just to give perspective, like Honduras is 5 times larger than El Salvador, and it has 2.6 million. And El Salvador is so cramped and so small. It had 3.7 million people. So it was overpopulated. Like, people just needed to move out for better life, better opportunity. Honestly, I feel like that's what immigrants do. Like, people just don't leave their home, their like place where they're born, just because of, shits and giggles. The Salvadorans needed to get out. Not only was El Salvador densely overpopulated, but at that time as well, El Salvador's wealth was concentrated in a coffee oligarchy. And I was like, what the heck is that?
No, I've never heard of it.
So that means an oligarchy. Let me Google it. So I'm actually saying the words of Google. Oligarchy is a small group of people having control of a country, organization, or institution. In this case, the coffee oligarchy was of 14 families. So the wealthiest and most influential people in El Salvador was 14 families, period. Over 3.7 million people lived there, but only 14 families held most of the wealth, the power, and the influence. And the land. Most importantly, the land. Because, you you plant coffee and then you lo cosechas and all of that. So those 3.7 million people were over it. They couldn't own land. They couldn't like work for themselves or work and get a good pay. So they would migrate to Honduras. Well, they would immigrate to Honduras, which is right there. And Honduras had a bunch of land where they could farm, they could work. Honduras, I think, had like, oh, this is why I'm like, I wish I had more like time, or it's just like more questions. Honduras, do you know the bananas? And it has like Chiquita, the woman.
Yep.
So Honduras was, so that's like in the Banana Republic type of company or something. I'm saying this completely wrong. I know if you're a pro, you know more about the Banana Republic, which is a fucking insane and bloody story. The history behind bananas are insane. And every time I buy a banana with the Chiquita, I feel guilty because I know I'm buying into oppression, but whatever. Maybe that's another story for another day. But Honduras had like the bananas. So Honduras had a lot of opportunities, land where you could farm, land where you could owe, and land where you could just be squatters and go undetected. So this had been happening for over 10 years already. I think more than that, honestly, because whenever I read history and there's a number, I'm like, it has to be more than that. So Salvadorians were going into Honduras, and it was a normal thing. That's where you would go for a better life. Honduras was okay with this, and they had a treaty from 1967. It was called the Bilateral Treaty on Immigration with El Salvador. They were like, okay, you can immigrate. We can, it was almost like an agreement of like, this is what we can do. So, months before the game, that year, so in January of 1969, Honduras doesn't renew the bilateral treaty on immigration. So they're like, you know what? We don't want you guys to immigrate here anymore. We want our land back. We want the properties that, belong to Hondurans back. And we don't want Salvadorians here anymore. And on April of 1969, Honduras announces it would begin to expel property owners without legal status. So they would begin to expel Salvadorians, and if you had a property in Honduras that was yours, it did not matter, you were out. This meant even if you're a Salvadorian married to a Honduran, they did not care, you were out. Since April, Honduras was already kicking out Salvadorians from their country, and El Salvador was receiving these immigrants. So the country is like feeling pressure and doesn't know what to do. They already didn't know what to do with the 3.7 million people they had, and now they're receiving more. In May of 1969, there's a mass deportation of Salvadorians. Everyone's out. And if you were Salvadorian in Honduras, there was reports of lynching and beating them up, and just think of all the abuse that a human can do to another human when they're not wanted in their country. And the cherry on top was in June of 1969, Honduras and El Salvador went against each other in a soccer game.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
That's super crazy.
Yeah. So, they had a lot of hostility, a lot of tension. And with the background being said, it makes sense why in June 8th, the Salvadorian who watched the soccer game and Honduras won offed herself. Because hope was very small. Honduras, I think both Honduras and El Salvador had propaganda. So I will say, my opinion is the victims here was like all the time when we see wars, the victims are the citizens of the country, because the government's kind of, instead of taking accountability, I think on both parts, the Salvadorian government and the Honduran government, they like incentivized people to hate on the other. So when the person offed themselves on June 8th, El Salvador ran with it. Like, look what happens because Hondurans, like, this person, you know, it's weird to hear of a funeral being mass televised if the person is not a celebrity. That's weird. And in Honduras, there was like things in the newspapers said like, don't buy Salvadorian products, do not buy, and then there's like lists of what not to buy. So both countries were hating on each other, but El Salvador needed Honduras to receive people. And when Honduras said no, I think El Salvador knew that they were going to be screwed. And they just, after the war was over, El Salvador was super duper broken. And people say that this then led to the Civil War of 1979. Because it was just like, people were, they call them peasants. I don't like using that word. But like farmers workers, campesinos is what they say in Spanish. So campesinos, the farmer workers, were freaking working for an oligarchy, even up to like 1969. That happened when, like, not that long ago, less than like 60 years ago. They were working for like pennies, and that's why they wanted to go to Honduras. But when Honduras was no longer an option, people explode.
That's a great story. That's a really great story.
Yeah.
I feel like there was, I don't know, it feels like there was a little bit of a ripple effect, like, based off some of the decisions that El Salvador made. Like, I feel like maybe, I don't know who their president was at the time, but maybe the leadership was just not that great. Because it's like, they're receiving, Honduras is deporting a bunch of people, which obviously, like, you know, was an issue. But then they had these soccer games, but then they're like, we're just about to go to war. But then after the war, nobody felt safe to be in Honduras anyways if they were Salvadorian. So, like, either way, more people are coming back into the country. It just felt like it was unnecessary to, like, go to war with them. You know
yes.
What I mean? Like, yeah. They should have invested their resources in, like, all right, how can we, like, what can we do to take in all the people who are being deported back here to El Salvador? Like, what can we do for our people versus, like, let's try to fight this other country?
I think what pissed off the Salvadorian government was when Honduras broke off diplomatic ties. Because I think that's when it turned very political. Like, before it was, you know, there was hints of politics in it, but one could argue, no, these are just really passionate fans. But then, like, the same day when El Salvador won on June 15th, the same day Honduras broke off political ties, diplomatic ties. I think that's when it was like, oh, okay, so this is deeper than just a soccer game. And I do agree about, like, it was unnecessary. I mean, but I think all war is.
True. Very true.
And so I believe that when El Salvador went into Honduras, it was almost like to show them, like, no, but, like, we're also strong. Like, we're also almost like egotistical, you know? And I mean, that ego cost the lives of like 2,000 people. That was like 500 people per day if it was 2,000 people. Can you imagine that?
That's crazy.
I did read some other, and as everything's linked below, like always, I read other stories, or like, there's a book about this, actually, which I want to read. It's a memoir, and they say how, like, Tegucigalpa, like Honduras, the capital, it was like complete darkness. Like people weren't allowed to like turn on a light because they shut off the electricity, and if you had a light, they would come and kill you. And there was Americans living there too, because you know Americans live there if you're a diplomat or like for other reasons. So like in this one article, the guy working, like I don't know if he was working, if he was a policeman, but he was checking up on like an American woman and her children, and like I don't know, people were scared. Like even if you didn't die or if you weren't like actively in the war, imagine like outside the electricity is off and people are just shooting aimlessly. Oh, another fact that I read was that Honduras also had gear from World War II. So it's crazy to think that both Honduras and El Salvador were probably going at each other with American gear from World War II. But with this, oh my gosh, now this story was hard for me because I feel like it's a middle point of a lot of things. Now I'm curious about the 14 families of the coffee oligarchy. I'm curious about, I read somewhere of the 1932 Salvadorian genocide. I think during this time in 1969 there was a dictatorship in El Salvador. I'm curious about the government at that time. I also want to cover in the future the Civil War. I think in other stories it feels kind of like removed when I speak about them, or it feels, what's it called, like there's a happy ending or like there's closure. But with this story I feel no closure, and I feel like it has opened up more questions for me as a Salvadorian rather than giving me more information. Because growing up when I was like 4, I thought Honduras was in El Salvador. I thought it was the same place. And now hearing that we like offed each other, it's kind of very disappointing because we're so close. We're so close to each other. And honestly, like this is very pessimistic, but it gives me less hope of the world. Because like I said, like I mentioned earlier, in the US, all you think about is the US border and the Mexico border. But you don't think about, oh, actually there's back home, the country I came from, there's border tension. And I know there's border tension in a ton of places. So it just makes me kind of sad that like humans naturally migrate just like animals. So I think this is gonna be a problem that just exists in our existence period. I'm sorry if this was a negative story at the end, or if the vibe is like sad, but I mean, history is honestly kind of sad sometimes, but it's our history, so it's good to know, and it explains a lot. 2 things I got from the story is El Salvador was overpopulated, and there was lack of opportunity, lack of upward mobility, and that's why people would move to Honduras. And that sounds very similar as to why people moved in the 80s because of the Civil War, and that's why people moved in the 2000s because of gang violence. And this history right here is literally still happening. Maybe now, I don't even want to talk about right now in El Salvador, honestly, but I can speak to the 2000s because that's where my wave of immigrants came. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. If you finished this video, thank you so much. I appreciate you like more than you know. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment below. I'm gonna try to find a fun story next time because this one was a little heavy. So maybe one war story and then a fun story and then another war story, you know. But anyways, thank you so much for watching and have a lovely day.